Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the gritty, complicated, and surprisingly regulated world of medieval brothels, where business acumen, social politics, and human nature collided in ways that would make modern entrepreneurs both cringe and take notes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me be clear from the start, this isn't about glorifying exploitation, but understanding one of history's most misunderstood professions. Picture this. It's 1348, and you're running what amounts to a medieval hospitality business in the heart of London, Paris, or Florence. If you thought managing a modern restaurant was complicated, think again. You're dealing with church officials who officially condemn you, but secretly regulate you. City councils that tax you while pretending you don't exist, and customers ranging from apprentice blacksmiths to actual royalty. Sound familiar? Welcome to the original gig economy. Let's be honest here. Prostitution wasn't some shadowy underground operation in medieval Europe. That's right. It was often legal, regulated, and integrated into the economic fabric of medieval cities. By the 14th century, many European cities had designated red light districts, complete with municipal regulations, health inspections, and tax collectors. The church? Well, they had a complicated relationship with the whole thing. St. Augustine himself argued that removing prostitution would fill the world with lust and disorder. Medieval theologians essentially treated it like a necessary evil, kind of like how we view parking meters today, to be fair. Running a medieval brothel wasn't just about managing what happened behind closed doors. You were essentially operating a complex business that functioned as part hotel, part tavern, part social club, and part conflict resolution center. Your typical day involved everything from negotiating with suppliers and managing staff schedules to mediating disputes between drunk nobles and handling surprise visits from church inspectors. Meanwhile, you had to navigate the intricate social hierarchies that determined everything from your customers' expectations to your legal standing in the community. The economics alone would boggle a modern MBA's mind. You weren't just selling services, you were managing real estate, running what amounted to a restaurant and bar, providing entertainment, offering banking services, yes, really, and sometimes even functioning as an informal diplomatic meeting ground. Of course, you also had to deal with the constant threat of disease, violence, legal changes, and the occasional moral crusade that could shut down your entire operation overnight. And yet, some of the most successful brothel owners in medieval Europe were women who wielded considerable economic and social power. These weren't victims of circumstance. They were shrewd business people who understood supply and demand, political networking, and customer service in ways that would impress modern executives. Still, their success came with unique challenges that highlight the complex intersection of gender, power, and commerce in medieval society. If you thought medieval society was all chivalry and courtly romance, you're about to discover a world where practicality trumped ideology every time. The reality is that prostitution served multiple social functions beyond the obvious. It provided economic opportunities for women in a severely limited job market, offered a social pressure valve for young men in a society that discouraged early marriage, and generated significant tax revenue for cash-strapped municipal governments. But here's where it gets really interesting. The medieval approach to regulating prostitution was often more sophisticated than what we see in many modern societies. Cities like Florence had detailed regulations covering everything from pricing structures to workplace safety. Brothel owners had to post bonds, maintain health standards, and follow strict rules about customer treatment. Meanwhile, the women working in these establishments often had more legal protections and economic autonomy than their married counterparts. The social dynamics were equally fascinating. A successful brothel owner occupied a unique position in medieval society, simultaneously marginalized and essential, condemned and consulted. They were often among the wealthiest people in their communities, yet excluded from certain social circles. They provided services that everyone used, but no one officially acknowledged. This contradiction created a complex web of relationships that required constant navigation. Throughout this exploration, we'll follow the daily routine of a composite medieval brothel owner, let's call her Marguerite, based on historical records from across Europe. We'll see how she manages her establishment, handles her relationships with authorities, deals with customers, and navigates the complex social and economic realities of her profession. From the pre-dawn preparations to the late-night security concerns, we'll discover how medieval business practices, social attitudes, and human nature intersected in ways that reveal surprising truths about both medieval society and human nature itself. So buckle up, because we're about to spend a day in one of medieval Europe's most controversial, misunderstood, and surprisingly regulated industries. Let's be clear about one thing. Running a medieval brothel meant you were essentially operating a 24-hour hospitality business centuries before the concept officially existed. While most of medieval Europe was still snoring away in their straw-filled beds, Marguerite was already up at 4 a.m., moving through her establishment like a general inspecting troops before battle. The first order of business? Security and inventory. That's right. Medieval brothel owners were among the first to understand that successful hospitality required obsessive attention to detail and constant vigilance. Marguerite would begin her rounds by checking that all doors and shutters were properly secured, not just for privacy, but because theft was a constant concern in an era where your neighbors might literally be eyeing your candlesticks. Medieval cities were dangerous places after dark, and establishments like Marguerite's were often targets for everything from petty theft to organized raids by rival business owners or religious zealots having a particularly righteous week. If you thought modern business security was complicated, imagine trying to protect your establishment when the local watch consisted of maybe 6 guys with sticks who knocked off at sunset. The inventory check was equally crucial. By candlelight, Marguerite would count everything from wine barrels to bed linens, making mental notes of what needed to be replaced or repaired. Medieval supply chains were notoriously unreliable. You couldn't just order new sheets on Amazon. When a customer got a little too enthusiastic with a dagger during a drunken argument. To be fair, managing inventory and age before mass production meant that everything from soap to silk had to be carefully budgeted and planned weeks in advance. Meanwhile, the kitchen preparations were beginning. And yes, medieval brothels had kitchens, extensive ones. These establishments weren't just about providing intimate services. They were full-service entertainment venues that competed with taverns and inns for customer loyalty. A smart brothel owner understood that the way to a customer's wallet was through his stomach first. Marguerite employed a cook whose culinary skills were as important to the business as any other service provided. The food served had to walk a careful line between affordable and impressive. Remember, your clientele ranged from apprentice craftsmen, spending their weekly wages, to wealthy merchants entertaining business associates. Sound familiar? It's the same challenge modern restaurants face when trying to appeal to both casual diners and high-end customers. The solution was menu flexibility. Simple meat pies and ale for the working crowd. Elaborate multi-course meals with imported spices for the wealthy patrons. But here's where medieval brothel management got really complex. The staff meetings. Of course, we're not talking about modern corporate gatherings with PowerPoint presentations. These were practical discussions about the day's expected customers, any potential problems on the horizon, and the division of responsibilities. Marguerite had to manage not just the women providing services, but also cooks, servers, musicians, security, and cleaning staff. The interpersonal dynamics were particularly tricky. Medieval society was built on rigid hierarchies, but brothels operated in a sort of social gray area where normal rules were suspended but never completely abandoned. A working woman might serve a nobleman one evening and a merchant's son the next, requiring constant adjustments in behavior and expectations. If you thought managing modern hospitality staff was challenging, imagine doing it when your employees had to navigate complex social protocols while dealing with intoxicated customers who might carry swords. Staff scheduling in medieval brothels was an art form that would impress modern workforce managers. You had to account for religious holidays, when business might be slow or completely shut down, market days, when business boomed, seasonal variations in trade, which affected customer demographics, and the unpredictable schedules of your regular clientele. And yet, unlike modern businesses, you couldn't just hire temporary staff when things got busy. Reputation and discretion were everything. Let's talk about the economics of these pre-dawn preparations. Everything cost money, and medieval brothel owners operated on much thinner margins than you might expect. The city took its cut through licensing fees and fines. The church extracted donations for various causes. Local officials expected regular gifts to ensure smooth operations, and suppliers charged premium prices because of the social stigma associated with serving such establishments. Still, successful operators like Marguerite understood that cutting corners on preparation meant losing customers to competitors. The competitive landscape was surprisingly sophisticated. By the 14th century, major European cities had multiple establishments competing for customers through quality of service, amenities, entertainment options, and pricing strategies. Meanwhile, unlicensed operators posed a constant threat by offering cut-rate services that could undercut legitimate businesses. Marguerite had to constantly balance competitive pricing with quality maintenance, a challenge that modern business owners would immediately recognize. Security preparations extended beyond just checking locks and counting inventory. Marguerite had to consider the political climate, recent changes in local law enforcement, conflicts between customer groups, and even the personal problems of regular patrons that might spill over into her establishment. Medieval society was intensely personal. Business disputes, family feuds, and political conflicts all played out in public spaces. And brothels were no exception. The morning briefings with security staff were particularly important. These weren't just bouncers in the modern sense. They were diplomatic troubleshooters who had to be able to handle everything from preventing fights between drunk apprentices to discreetly managing situations where married customers encountered each other with their respective companions. And yet, they also had to maintain the delicate balance of authority that kept order without alienating customers who expected to be treated according to their social status. Perhaps most importantly, these pre-dawn hours were when Marguerite handled the business relationships that kept her establishment running. Medieval commerce depended heavily on personal connections and mutual obligations, so maintaining good relationships with suppliers, officials, and even competitors required constant attention. A late payment to the wine merchant might mean inferior quality stock, while a slight to a city official could result in surprise inspections or increased fines. The psychological preparation required for managing such a complex operation cannot be understated. Medieval society was unforgiving to business failures, particularly in industries that operated on the margins of respectability. Marguerite had to mentally prepare herself each morning for a day that could bring everything from lucrative business opportunities to life-threatening crises. The stress management techniques available to medieval entrepreneurs were limited. Prayer, herbal remedies, and the kind of stoic acceptance that modern self-help books try to teach but medieval people learned through daily survival. The networking activities that began before dawn were crucial for long-term business success. Medieval commerce depended heavily on personal relationships and mutual obligations, requiring constant attention to relationship maintenance and development. Marguerite might spend these early hours reviewing her mental database of customer preferences, business debts, political obligations, and social connections that needed attention during the day's operations. If you thought modern CRM systems were sophisticated, medieval entrepreneurs had to maintain all this relationship intelligence in their heads, while managing the daily pressures of business operations. And yet, the pre-dawn hours also represented opportunity for innovation and business development that the chaos of normal operations didn't allow. This was when Marguerite could think strategically about operational improvements, competitive responses, and expansion opportunities that might enhance her establishment's long-term prospects. Medieval business innovation was driven by necessity and implemented through trial and error, making these quiet planning periods essential for staying ahead of competition and adapting to changing market conditions. The coordination with other businesses in the district was another crucial pre-dawn activity. Medieval commercial districts operated as interconnected ecosystems where the success of individual businesses depended partly on collective prosperity and mutual support. Marguerite had to maintain relationships with neighboring establishments, coordinate on security concerns, and sometimes collaborate on special events or promotional activities that could benefit all district businesses. Meanwhile, she also had to be prepared for competitive conflicts and business rivalries that could turn ugly if not managed carefully. The municipal relationship management that occurred during these early hours was particularly delicate. City officials, tax collectors, and various bureaucrats all had expectations and requirements that successful brothel operators had to meet while maintaining the discretion and political neutrality that kept their establishments operating. Marguerite might use pre-dawn hours to plan approaches to officials who needed attention, prepare for expected inspections, or develop strategies for handling regulatory changes that could affect her operations. The international connections that medieval brothel operations maintained were surprisingly extensive and required ongoing attention to relationship management and information exchange. Marguerite's establishment might serve traveling merchants from across Europe, creating opportunities for intelligence gathering about foreign markets, political developments, and business opportunities that extended far beyond local concerns. Meanwhile, she also had to stay current on international currency fluctuations, trade route disruptions, and political conflicts that could affect her diverse customer base. By the time most of medieval Europe was beginning to stir with the sounds of morning prayers and roosters crowing, Marguerite's establishment was already operating like a well-tuned machine, prepared for another day of navigating the complex intersection of business, politics, and human nature that defined medieval urban commerce. The contrast with most medieval businesses was striking. While other enterprises opened their doors and hoped for the best, successful brothel operations succeeded through meticulous planning, careful relationship management, and an understanding of human psychology that would make modern business consultants envious. By sunrise, when most medieval cities were just beginning to stir with the sounds of roosters and early morning prayers, Marguerite's establishment was transitioning into what we might call the business breakfast crowd. If you thought the modern concept of power lunches was revolutionary, let me introduce you to medieval morning meetings that took place in brothels, because sometimes the most important business discussions happened in the most unexpected places. Let's be honest about the morning clientele. These weren't your typical late-night revelers. Dawn customers were often merchants, craftsmen, and minor officials who needed to conduct business before their wives woke up, or travelers who had arrived in the city overnight and needed both accommodation and information about local business opportunities. Sound familiar? It's basically the medieval equivalent of hotel business centers and networking events. The challenge for Marguerite was managing these different needs simultaneously. A traveling wool merchant might need a private room to examine samples and negotiate with local buyers, while also requiring companionship and entertainment. Meanwhile, a group of guild members might use her establishment as an unofficial meeting place to discuss matters they couldn't address in more formal settings. To be fair, medieval society had very few neutral spaces where people from different social classes could interact freely, making establishments like Marguerite's surprisingly important to local commerce. But here's where things get really interesting. The information economy. Medieval brothels were essentially early versions of modern business intelligence networks. Think about it. People from all walks of life shared their secrets, complaints, plans, and gossip in these establishments. A smart brothel owner like Marguerite didn't just provide services. She collected, processed, and strategically shared information that could make or break business deals across the city. The morning routine required careful orchestration of multiple activities. In the main hall, servants were serving breakfast and ale to early customers, while Marguerite moved between groups, greeting regulars, welcoming newcomers, and subtly managing the social dynamics that kept everything running smoothly. Meanwhile, private chambers were being prepared for more intimate negotiations, both business and personal. And yes, the distinction between the two was often blurrier than modern minds might expect. Managing the morning staff required particular skill, because many of them had been working late into the night and were operating on minimal sleep. Medieval labor practices didn't include concepts like overtime pay or mandatory rest periods, but smart business owners understood that exhausted employees provided poor service. Marguerite had developed a rotation system that ensured someone was always fresh and alert, even during the transition between night and day operations. The economics of morning business were particularly complex. Early customers often wanted credit arrangements. They might be waiting for ships to arrive, goods to sell, or payments from other business ventures. Meanwhile, Marguerite had her own cash flow to manage, with suppliers expecting payment, staff requiring wages, and various authorities demanding their cuts. If you thought modern business financing was complicated, imagine running a cash-intensive business in an era before. Banks, credit cards, or standardized accounting practices. Let's talk about the regulatory compliance that had to happen every morning. Medieval cities had detailed rules about brothel operations, opening hours, pricing structures, customer behavior standards, health requirements, and neighborhood relations. City inspectors could show up unannounced. Church officials might demand evidence of proper moral guidance, and guild representatives could investigate complaints about unfair business practices. That's right. Even medieval vice had bureaucracy. The neighborhood relations aspect was particularly delicate. Brothels were often located in designated districts, but they still had to coexist with other businesses and residential areas. Morning was when complaints about noise, disturbances, or moral corruption were most likely to be lodged with authorities. Marguerite had to maintain relationships with neighbors, local merchants, and community leaders who officially disapproved of her business, but unofficially benefited from the economic activity it generated. Meanwhile, the competitive intelligence gathering was in full swing. Marguerite's staff would report on activities at rival establishments, new services being offered, changes in pricing, staff departures, customer complaints, or legal troubles. Medieval business competition was intensely personal and often vicious, with operators using everything from price wars to character assassination to gain advantages over rivals. Customer service in the morning required different skills than evening entertainment. Dawn patrons were often conducting serious business and needed privacy, discretion, and professional service rather than party atmosphere. And yet, They also expected the establishment to provide the amenities and social lubrication that facilitated successful negotiations. Balancing these needs required staff who could seamlessly transition between roles as servers, companions, entertainers, and confidential assistants. The morning meal service was particularly important because it set the tone for the entire day's business relationships. Medieval dining was intensely social and symbolic. The quality of food, the manner of service, and the social dynamics at the table all communicated messages about status, respect, and business intentions. A poorly managed breakfast could destroy relationships that took months to build, while an expertly orchestrated meal could cement deals worth hundreds of pounds. Security during morning hours required a different approach than nighttime operations. Instead of preventing drunken fights, Marguerite's security staff had to manage the discreet arrival and departure of customers who couldn't afford to be recognized, mediate disputes between business partners using the establishment as a neutral meeting ground, and ensure that valuable goods or documents being discussed or exchanged remained secure. The social dynamics were endlessly complex. A successful brothel owner had to understand the intricate relationships between different customer groups, which guild members were feuding, which merchants were forming partnerships, which officials were investigating which businesses, and which marriages or family alliances were creating new power structures in the city. Of course, this information was valuable currency that could be traded for favors, protection, or business opportunities. The document security services that medieval brothel operations provided were often overlooked but crucial to their business success. Traveling merchants needed secure storage for valuable documents, contracts, and correspondence while conducting business in unfamiliar cities. Marguerite's establishment might function as an informal document repository, providing storage services that complemented the hospitality and entertainment offerings. Of course, this service also provided opportunities for intelligence gathering, as the content and nature of stored documents could reveal valuable information about trade patterns, business relationships, and economic opportunities. The translation and interpretation services that some establishments provided reflected the international character of medieval urban commerce. Marguerite might employ staff members who spoke multiple languages and could facilitate business negotiations between customers who didn't share common languages. Meanwhile, these linguistic capabilities also enhanced the establishment's ability to serve diverse international clientele and gather intelligence about foreign markets and political developments. If you thought modern business globalization was complex, medieval establishments were managing multicultural operations centuries before international business became a formal academic discipline. The diplomatic functions that occurred during morning hours were equally sophisticated and historically significant. Medieval diplomacy was often conducted through informal channels that supplemented official governmental negotiations, and establishments like Marguerite's provided neutral territories where representatives of different political entities could meet without the protocol complications that formal diplomatic settings required. These informal diplomatic activities influenced everything from local trade agreements to international political relationships, making successful brothel operators informal participants in medieval power politics. The educational services that some establishments provided revealed another dimension of their social and economic significance. Medieval education was limited and expensive, but successful operators, like Marguerite, understood that knowledgeable staff could provide informal educational services that enhanced customer satisfaction and generated additional revenue. These might include instruction in languages, business practices, social protocols, or cultural knowledge that traveling customers needed to succeed in local markets. Still, The educational content had to be carefully balanced to provide value without revealing sensitive information that could compromise business relationships or competitive advantages. The religious accommodation that morning operations required was particularly complex because medieval Christianity dominated social and political life, while simultaneously creating moral conflicts about the legitimacy of establishments like Marguerite's. Morning customers might include church officials who needed to conduct business before religious obligations, while staff members required time for morning prayers and religious observances that couldn't be ignored without risking community censure. Meanwhile, the establishment itself might maintain religious symbols and practices that demonstrated appropriate respect for Christian values while avoiding the kind of ostentatious piety that could appear hypocritical. The health and medical services that some establishments provided reflected both the limited availability of medieval healthcare and the practical needs of customers who traveled extensively or lived in challenging urban conditions. Marguerite might employ staff members with knowledge of herbal remedies, basic medical treatments, or health maintenance practices that could address customer health concerns while generating additional revenue. And yet, these medical services also created legal and ethical responsibilities that required careful management to avoid accusations of quackery or unauthorized medical practice that could trigger regulatory problems. The agricultural connections that morning operations maintained were crucial for supply chain management and economic sustainability. Medieval urban businesses depended on rural agricultural production for everything from food supplies to raw materials, requiring ongoing relationships with farmers, agricultural merchants, and rural communities that could provide reliable access to necessary goods. Marguerite's establishment might serve rural customers during market periods, while maintaining year-round relationships with agricultural suppliers, who could provide preferential access to high-quality products. When the church bells chimed noon across medieval Europe, Marguerite's establishment hit its stride in ways that would make modern business consultants weep with envy. This was prime time, the sweet spot between morning business meetings and evening entertainment, when the establishment functioned as something resembling a medieval combination of stock exchange, social club, and diplomatic embassy all rolled into one. Let's be clear about what midday meant in medieval cities. This was when serious money changed hands. The morning's preliminary negotiations had concluded. Merchants had inspected goods and assessed market conditions, and now the real wheeling and dealing began. If you thought modern networking events were intense, imagine conducting business in a society where your word was literally your bond. Contracts were sealed with handshakes and witness toasts, and a single bad reputation could destroy generations of family commerce. The lunch crowd at Marguerite's represented a fascinating cross-section of medieval society. Guild masters rubbed shoulders with traveling merchants. Minor nobles conducted business with wealthy craftsmen and church officials. Yes, church officials discreetly handled financial matters they couldn't address in more formal settings. To be fair, the medieval church was one of Europe's largest financial institutions, and its representatives needed places to conduct business that wasn't subject to the same scrutiny as official, ecclesiastical meetings. Managing this diverse clientele required diplomatic skills that would impress modern ambassadors. Marguerite had to ensure that competing business interests didn't clash. Rival guild members didn't start fights, and political enemies didn't encounter each other in compromising situations. Sound familiar? It's essentially the same challenge faced by modern conference organizers, except the stakes were higher and the participants carried weapons. The dining arrangements were a masterclass in medieval social engineering. Different rooms served different purposes and social levels. The main hall accommodated general business dining. Private chambers handled sensitive negotiations, and semi-private booths allowed for discreet conversations within the larger social setting. Meanwhile, the quality of service, food, and amenities automatically adjusted based on the customer's social status and spending power. A sophisticated form of market segmentation that modern hospitality industries still struggle to perfect. But here's where medieval brothel operations get really sophisticated: the credit and banking functions. That's right. Establishments like Marguerite's often served as informal banks, providing currency exchange, secure storage, and even lending services. Medieval Europe's banking system was still developing, and legitimate financial institutions were often restricted by church prohibitions on usury or limited by guild regulations. Brothels, operating in legal gray areas, could provide financial services that were desperately needed but officially discouraged. The information trading that occurred during Midday was phenomenal. Marguerite maintained what amounted to a medieval intelligence network, collecting and processing information about trade routes, political developments, military movements, and economic opportunities. This intelligence was then strategically shared with customers in ways that built loyalty, generated additional revenue, and maintained the establishment's reputation as a valuable business resource. Meanwhile, the competitive advantages gained through superior information access often meant the difference between business success and failure. Let's talk about the logistics of managing midday operations. The kitchen was operating at full capacity, preparing meals that ranged from simple fare for apprentices to elaborate banquets for wealthy patrons. The serving staff had to navigate complex social protocols, addressing customers according to their rank, understanding which business relationships were friendly or hostile, and maintaining the discreet atmosphere that kept everyone comfortable. And yet, they also had to process payments, manage bar tabs, and handle the constant flow of messages and communications that connected the establishment to the broader city economy. The entertainment provided during midday hours was more sophisticated than modern minds might expect. We're not talking about crude performances, but skilled musicians, storytellers, and conversationalists who could enhance business negotiations, provide social lubrication for difficult discussions, and create the relaxed atmosphere that facilitated successful deal-making. Medieval business culture was intensely personal and relationship-driven, making social skills as important as financial acumen. Quality control was constant and multifaceted. Marguerite had to monitor everything from food safety and wine quality to the behavior of staff and customers. Medieval health standards were different from modern expectations, but successful business owners understood that reputation was everything. A single incident of food poisoning, theft, or inappropriate behavior could destroy relationships that took years to build. Of course, word of mouth was the primary marketing tool, making customer satisfaction absolutely critical. The regulatory compliance during peak hours was particularly challenging. City inspectors, tax collectors, guild representatives, and church officials all had the authority to investigate various aspects of the operation, and they often chose busy periods to maximize the impact of their visits. Marguerite had to maintain perfect records, ensure all fees were paid, and demonstrate compliance with constantly changing regulations while keeping business flowing smoothly. Staff management during midday required understanding individual strengths and customer preferences. Some servers were better with merchant customers, others excelled with noble clients, and still others specialized in handling the church officials who needed to maintain their dignity while conducting unofficial business. Meanwhile, the women providing companionship had to be matched with customers based on social class, personal preferences, and business requirements. If you thought modern human resources was complicated, try managing a workforce where employee performance directly impacted your relationship with local authorities. The competitive landscape during midday hours was intensely active. Rival establishments were constantly trying to poach customers, undercut pricing, or spread rumors that could damage reputations. Marguerite had to maintain competitive pricing while ensuring quality didn't suffer, develop unique services that differentiated her establishment, and build customer loyalty that could withstand attempts at competitive recruitment. Still, she also had to collaborate with competitors when mutual interests were at stake, such as lobbying for favorable regulations or coordinating responses to moral crusades. Security during peak hours focused more on discrete problem prevention than obvious enforcement. The goal was to handle potential issues before they became public problems that could embarrass customers or attract unwanted attention from authorities. This required staff who could read social situations, anticipate conflicts, and intervene diplomatically without disrupting the business atmosphere. And yet, they also had to be prepared for the occasional situation that required more forceful intervention. The insurance and risk management services that medieval brothel operations pioneered were remarkably sophisticated, given the limited financial instruments available during this period. Successful operators like Marguerite understood that their customers faced constant risks: theft, injury, business failure, political persecution that could destroy livelihoods overnight. By developing informal insurance arrangements, pooled risk systems, and mutual support networks, these establishments provided financial security services that wouldn't be formally institutionalized for centuries. Of course, providing these services also created additional revenue streams and strengthened customer loyalty by addressing fundamental security needs that medieval society couldn't otherwise meet. The artisan and craft support services that Midday operations provided reflected the integrated nature of medieval urban economies and the diverse needs of customer bases that included skilled craftsmen and creative professionals. Marguerite's establishment might provide workshop space, tool storage, or exhibition opportunities for artisans who needed flexible working arrangements or neutral venues for displaying their work to potential customers. Meanwhile, the social networking opportunities available through the establishment could connect craftsmen with wealthy patrons, business partners, or collaborative opportunities that enhanced their economic prospects. The conflict resolution services that establishments like Marguerite's provided were crucial for maintaining business relationships and community stability in societies where formal legal systems were limited and often ineffective. Medieval disputes could escalate quickly into violence or long-term feuds that disrupted commerce and social order, making neutral mediation services valuable for all parties involved. Successful brothel operators developed reputations for fairness and discretion that made their establishments preferred venues for resolving conflicts between business partners, family members, or political rivals who needed trusted third-party intervention. The transportation and logistics coordination that Midday operations facilitated reflected the complex supply chain management requirements of medieval commerce and the networking opportunities that brought diverse business interests together in single locations. Marguerite might coordinate shipping arrangements, facilitate cargo sharing, or provide secure storage for goods in transit, creating additional revenue streams while strengthening relationships with merchant customers. Meanwhile, the information networks maintained through the establishment could provide valuable intelligence about transportation costs, route security, and market conditions that affected logistics planning and business decision-making. The political intelligence gathering that occurred during midday hours was sophisticated enough to influence local and regional political developments through the strategic sharing of information about governmental activities, policy changes, and political relationships. Medieval politics were intensely personal and often conducted through informal channels that supplemented official governmental processes, making establishments like Marguerite's important sources of political intelligence and influence. Still, participating in political intelligence activities created risks as well as opportunities, requiring careful balance. between serving customer interests and avoiding entanglement in political conflicts that could destroy business relationships or trigger governmental persecution. The technological innovation support that some establishments provided reflected the practical problem-solving needs of medieval businesses and the collaborative opportunities that diverse customer bases created. For sharing knowledge and expertise, Marguerite's establishment might serve as an informal research and development center where craftsmen, merchants, and scholars could share ideas, test innovations, and develop new approaches to technical challenges that affected multiple industries. These innovation networks contributed to medieval technological development while creating additional revenue opportunities and strengthening customer relationships through value-added services. The cultural preservation and transmission activities that occurred during midday operations were historically significant because they contributed to the preservation and evolution of medieval European culture through informal educational and entertainment activities. The stories, songs, and cultural knowledge shared in establishments like Marguerite's helped maintain cultural continuity while facilitating cultural exchange between different regions and social groups. Meanwhile, the multilingual and multicultural character of many establishments made them important centers for cultural synthesis and innovation that influenced broader European cultural development. The afternoon hours in medieval Europe brought a natural pause to the frantic pace of midday commerce, but for Marguerite, this lull was anything but restful. If you thought running a modern service business meant constant activity, medieval brothel operations required using every quiet moment for the maintenance, relationship building, and strategic planning that kept the enterprise running smoothly. Let's be honest, this was when the real business management happened, while her customers were attending to their own afternoon obligations, guild meetings, family responsibilities, religious observances, or simply the midday rest that medieval work schedules accommodated. Marguerite focused on the operational details that determined long-term success. That's right. Successful medieval business owners understood that customer-facing activities were only part of the equation. The behind-the-scenes work was what separated thriving enterprises from failed ventures. The first priority during afternoon hours was facility maintenance and preparation for evening operations. Medieval buildings required constant attention. Roof repairs, wall maintenance, floor cleaning, and the endless battle against vermin that plagued urban establishments. To be fair, medieval construction and sanitation standards were quite different from modern expectations. But smart business owners understood that cleanliness and comfort directly impacted customer satisfaction and retention. Staff. The briefing and planning sessions were crucial afternoon activities. Marguerite would meet individually with key staff members to discuss morning observations, customer feedback, potential problems, and operational improvements. These weren't formal performance reviews in the modern sense, but practical conversations about how to better serve customers, handle difficult situations, and maintain the establishment's reputation. Meanwhile, new staff received ongoing training in everything from social protocols to conflict resolution. Let's talk about the financial management that occurred during these quiet hours. Medieval accounting was a complex challenge involving multiple currencies, credit arrangements, barter transactions, and the various fees and taxes that authorities collected from businesses like Marguerite's. She had to track everything from daily receipts and supplier payments to quarterly tax, obligations, and annual licensing fees. Sound familiar? It's essentially the same challenge modern small business owners face, except without computers, standardized accounting practices, or professional financial advisors. The supply chain management was equally demanding. Afternoon was when Marguerite negotiated with suppliers, planned inventory purchases, and managed the logistics of obtaining everything her establishment needed. Medieval supply chains were notoriously unreliable, wars, weather, disease, and political upheavals could disrupt deliveries for weeks or months. Successful operators maintained relationships with multiple suppliers, stockpiled essential items, and developed contingency plans for various disruption scenarios. But here's where medieval business operations get really interesting: the relationship management with authorities. Marguerite had to maintain ongoing connections with city officials, church representatives, guild leaders, and law enforcement personnel who could either protect or destroy her business. This required a delicate balance of respect, financial contributions, information sharing, and mutual back-scratching that would make modern lobbyists envious. Of course, medieval politics were intensely personal, making these relationships both more important and more fragile than modern regulatory compliance. Competitive intelligence gathering intensified during afternoon hours when operators had time to analyze information collected throughout the day. Marguerite's network of contacts, suppliers, customers, staff, and even competitors provided constant updates about changes in the local business environment, new opportunities, and potential threats. This information was then processed and used to adjust pricing, modify services, plan expansions, or prepare defensive strategies against competitive challenges. The afternoon was also when Marguerite handled the correspondence that kept her connected to the broader medieval economy. Letters from suppliers, messages from customers, communications with business partners in other cities, and reports from her own intelligence network all required responses that could influence business relationships and opportunities. Medieval communication was slow and unreliable, making written correspondence both crucial and challenging to manage effectively. Staff scheduling for evening operations required careful consideration of customer expectations, individual employee capabilities, and the complex social dynamics that determined who could serve whom. Medieval society's rigid class distinctions meant that mismatched service relationships could offend customers and damage business relationships. Meanwhile, staff members had their own preferences, strengths, and limitations that influenced their effectiveness with different customer segments. Let's discuss the legal compliance activities that filled afternoon hours. Medieval regulations governing establishments like Marguerite's were constantly evolving, often contradictory, and always subject to interpretation by various authorities. She had to stay current on changes in city ordinances, church policies, guild regulations, and royal decrees that could affect her operations. And yet, she also had to understand how these official rules were actually enforced in practice, which often differed significantly from the written requirements. Quality control during afternoon preparation was essential for evening success. Everything from wine quality and food freshness to linens and lighting required attention. Medieval customers had different expectations than modern consumers, but they were equally sensitive to poor quality or inadequate service. The reputation effects of disappointing customers were more severe in medieval society because word of mouth was the primary communication mechanism and social networks were smaller and more tightly connected. The strategic planning that occurred during afternoon hours involved both short-term operational adjustments and long-term business development. Marguerite had to constantly evaluate market conditions, assess competitive threats, identify growth opportunities, and plan for seasonal variations in business volume. Medieval business cycles were closely tied to agricultural seasons, religious calendars, and trade patterns that could dramatically affect customer demographics and spending patterns. Employee development and training continued during afternoon hours through informal mentoring, skills development, and relationship building. Medieval employment was intensely personal, and successful business owners understood that investing in staff capabilities and loyalty paid dividends in customer satisfaction and operational efficiency. This was particularly important in an industry where discretion social skills, and emotional intelligence were as important as technical competencies. The networking activities that occurred during afternoon visits to suppliers, meetings with other business owners, and social interactions with community leaders were essential for long-term success. Medieval commerce depended heavily on personal relationships and mutual obligations, making ongoing relationship maintenance a constant business requirement. Still, these networking activities had to be balanced with operational demands and the social constraints that limited how openly brothel owners could participate in community activities. The research and development activities that occurred during afternoon hours were surprisingly sophisticated and historically significant for their contributions to medieval business innovation and technological advancement. Marguerite might use quiet periods to experiment with new service offerings, test operational improvements, or develop innovative approaches to customer satisfaction that could provide competitive advantages. Medieval business innovation was driven by practical necessity and implemented through trial and error, making these experimental periods essential for staying ahead of competition and adapting to changing market conditions. Still, innovation activities also required resource investment and risk tolerance that not all operators could afford, creating competitive advantages for establishments that could successfully implement new approaches. The international correspondence and communication activities that filled afternoon hours reflected the global reach of medieval commerce and the networking opportunities that successful operators created through their diverse customer relationships. Marguerite might maintain regular correspondence with business partners in other cities, suppliers in different regions, or information contacts across Europe who could provide intelligence about market conditions, political developments, and business opportunities. Medieval communication was slow and unreliable, making these correspondence activities both crucial for business success and challenging to manage effectively. Meanwhile, the content and timing of international communications could influence everything from inventory planning and pricing strategies to competitive positioning and risk management. The environmental management and sustainability practices that afternoon operations required were more sophisticated than modern minds might expect, reflecting both the limited resources available to medieval businesses and the practical necessity of maintaining operational efficiency over long periods. Marguerite had to manage everything from waste disposal and water usage to energy consumption and resource conservation in ways that balanced operational requirements with community standards and environmental limitations. Medieval cities were densely populated and poorly sanitized, making environmental management both crucial for business success and challenging to implement effectively. And yet, successful operators understood that environmental stewardship could provide competitive advantages through cost reduction, community goodwill, and operational efficiency. The intellectual property and trade secret management that afternoon planning required reflected the competitive intelligence and business innovation activities that distinguished successful establishments from their less sophisticated competitors. Marguerite had to protect valuable business information, customer lists, pricing strategies, operational techniques, supplier relationships, while gathering competitive intelligence about rival establishments and market developments. Medieval business competition was often vicious and personal, making information security essential for maintaining competitive advantages and preventing business sabotage. Meanwhile, the strategic sharing of selected information could facilitate business relationships and collaborative opportunities that enhanced long-term prospects. The crisis prevention and early warning system maintenance that occupied afternoon hours were essential for business survival in environments where political, economic, and social conditions could change rapidly and unpredictably. Marguerite had to monitor multiple information sources for signs of potential problems, regulatory changes, competitive threats, customer dissatisfaction, staff issues, supply chain disruptions, while developing contingency plans for various crisis scenarios. Medieval business operators faced existential threats that modern entrepreneurs rarely encounter, making crisis prevention and emergency preparedness crucial business competencies. Of course, the resources required for comprehensive crisis prevention were substantial, creating ongoing tension between immediate operational needs and long-term survival. Requirements taught the community service and social responsibility activities that some establishments undertook during afternoon hours reflected both genuine civic commitment and strategic public relations management, designed to maintain community support and regulatory tolerance. Marguerite might contribute to charitable activities, support community events, or provide services for community members who couldn't afford normal commercial rates. Medieval society was highly integrated, making community relationships crucial for business success and regulatory compliance. Still, community service activities had to be balanced with business requirements and the social constraints that limited how openly establishments like Marguerite's could participate in community activities without creating moral conflicts or political complications. When the sun began to set over medieval Europe and working hours officially ended for most citizens, Marguerite's establishment transformed into something that would make modern entertainment venues jealous of its energy, sophistication, and sheer profitability. This was prime time, when the real money was made and the most complex social and business dynamics played out under flickering candlelight and the cover of gathering darkness. Let's be clear about what evening meant in medieval society. This was when the social restrictions that governed daylight hours loosened considerably. If you thought modern nightlife was wild, medieval evenings were when merchants, craftsmen, nobles, and clergy all shed their daytime personas and engaged in behaviors that would have been scandalous during business hours. The transformation was remarkable. Reserved guildmasters became boisterous storytellers. Stern church officials revealed surprisingly sophisticated senses of humor, and wealthy merchants displayed generosity that contradicted their daytime penny-pinching reputations. The customer demographic shifted dramatically as evening progressed. Early arrivals were often regular customers seeking familiar companionship and entertainment after long days of work or business. To be fair, medieval work schedules were punishing by modern standards, and establishments like Marguerite's provided social outlets that simply didn't exist elsewhere in medieval society. Meanwhile, later arrivals included out-of-town visitors, celebration groups, and the kind of impromptu gatherings that generated the highest profits and the most interesting social dynamics. Managing the evening rush required orchestrating multiple complex activities simultaneously. The main hall buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the kind of networking that would make modern business conferences seem subdued by comparison. Private chambers hosted everything from intimate encounters to sensitive business negotiations that required absolute privacy. Semi-private booths accommodated small groups, celebrating successful deals or drowning their sorrows after commercial disasters. And yet, throughout it all, Marguerite moved like a conductor managing an orchestra, ensuring that the various activities enhanced rather than interfered with each other. The entertainment provided during evening hours was sophisticated beyond modern expectations. We're talking about skilled musicians who could perform everything from popular ballads to complex instrumental pieces. Storytellers whose repertoires included both classical tales and current gossip, and conversationalists whose wit and intelligence could match any customer's verbal sparring. Medieval entertainment was interactive and participatory. Audiences expected to join in songs, contribute to stories, and engage in the kind of verbal battles that demonstrated education and social status. But here's where evening operations get really complex: the social hierarchy management. Medieval society was built on rigid class distinctions. But brothels operated as neutral territories where normal social rules were suspended without being completely abandoned. A wealthy merchant might find himself sharing a table with minor nobility, while a church official could engage in conversations with guild members that would be impossible in daylight settings. Sound familiar? It's like modern networking events, except the social stakes were much higher and the potential for explosive conflicts much greater. The dining service during evening hours was a masterclass in medieval hospitality. Different customer groups required different levels of service, food quality, and social attention. Apprentices spending their weekly wages expected hearty food and strong ale served efficiently and affordably. Wealthy patrons demanded elaborate meals, fine wines, and personalized service that demonstrated their status and importance. Meanwhile, mixed groups required carefully balanced service that acknowledged individual status levels without creating awkward social situations. Staff coordination during the evening rush was like managing a medieval version of a modern hotel during a major convention. Everyone from servers and entertainers to security and cleaning staff had to work together seamlessly while adapting to constantly changing customer needs and social dynamics. And yet, unlike modern service industries with standardized procedures and management hierarchies, medieval operations depended on individual initiative, social intelligence, and the kind of teamwork that developed through shared experience rather than formal training. The pricing strategies employed during evening hours were remarkably sophisticated. Marguerite had to balance competitive pricing with profit maximization while accounting for customer spending power, service complexity, and seasonal demand variations. Medieval customers were acutely aware of value. They expected quality, proportional to price and service levels appropriate to their social status. Meanwhile, the competition was intense, with multiple establishments competing for the same customer base through pricing, service quality, and unique amenities. Let's talk about the risk management that evening operations required. Medieval cities became significantly more dangerous after dark, and establishments like Marguerite's attracted both legitimate customers and various criminal elements looking for opportunities. Security staff had to prevent theft, manage conflicts between intoxicated customers, handle situations involving weapons, which most customers carried, and maintain order without alienating paying clients. Of course, they also had to be prepared for surprise raids by moral authorities, competitive sabotage, and the occasional political upheaval that could turn customers into enemies overnight. The information economy that operated during evening hours was phenomenal. Alcohol loosened tongues, social dynamics encouraged sharing, and the relaxed atmosphere led to conversations that revealed business secrets, political developments, and personal information that had significant value. Marguerite and her staff collected this intelligence while maintaining the discretion that kept customers comfortable sharing sensitive information. Meanwhile, they strategically shared information in ways that facilitated business deals, resolved conflicts, and maintained their reputation as a valuable resource for their community. Quality control during the evening rush was both crucial and challenging. Everything from food safety and beverage quality to staff behavior and customer satisfaction required constant monitoring. Medieval customers might be more tolerant of certain conditions than modern consumers, but they were equally sensitive to poor service or inadequate value. Still, the fast pace and complex social dynamics made quality control more difficult just when it was most important for maintaining customer relationships and generating positive word of mouth. The competitive dynamics during evening hours were intense and multifaceted. Rival establishments tried to poach customers through aggressive pricing, superior entertainment, or promises of better service. Meanwhile, Marguerite had to maintain competitive advantages while avoiding the kind of confrontations that could escalate into business-destroying conflicts. Medieval competition was personal and often vicious. But successful operators understood that collaboration was sometimes more profitable than competition. Customer relationship management during evening operations required balancing individual attention with group dynamics, personal preferences with social expectations, and business objectives with genuine hospitality. Regular customers expected recognition and personalized service, while new visitors needed to be welcomed and integrated into the social environment. Meanwhile, mixed groups required careful management to ensure that different social levels, business interests, and personal relationships didn't create conflicts that could disrupt the entire establishment's atmosphere. The psychological counseling and emotional support services that evening operations provided were crucial for customer satisfaction and loyalty, reflecting the limited availability of mental health resources in medieval society and the emotional challenges that medieval life imposed on individuals across all social classes. Many customers sought not just entertainment and physical companionship, but emotional understanding and psychological relief from the stresses of medieval life, financial pressures, family obligations, social expectations, and political uncertainties that created constant anxiety and emotional strain. Successful establishments like Marguerite's employed staff members who could provide sophisticated emotional support and interpersonal counseling that helped customers manage psychological challenges while building long-term loyalty and trust. The celebration and special event management at evening hours accommodated reflected the important role that establishments like Marguerite's played in medieval social life and the sophisticated event planning capabilities that successful operators developed to serve diverse customer needs. Business successes, personal milestones, political appointments, and social achievements all required celebration venues that could provide appropriate atmosphere, entertainment, and services for different types of gatherings. Marguerite had to coordinate everything from menu planning and entertainment selection to security arrangements and protocol management for events that ranged from intimate, personal celebrations to large business gatherings that included multiple social classes and competing interests. The auction and marketplace activities that some establishments hosted during evening hours reflected their role as commercial centers that facilitated trade and business relationships beyond their primary service offerings. Marguerite's establishment might serve as a venue for informal auctions of valuable goods, private sales of specialized items, or marketplace activities that connected buyers and sellers who needed neutral territory for conducting business. These commercial activities generated additional revenue while strengthening business relationships and providing valuable intelligence about market conditions, pricing trends, and commercial opportunities that could influence operational planning and strategic decision-making. The apprenticeship and training programs that evening operations sometimes provided reflected the educational and professional development needs of medieval society and the opportunities that successful establishments created for knowledge transfer and skill development. Marguerite might offer informal training in languages, business practices, social protocols, or specialized skills that helped young people develop capabilities needed for success in medieval commerce. Meanwhile, the establishment could serve as a networking venue where apprentices could meet potential mentors, business partners, or employers who could advance their career prospects. Of course, these educational activities also created additional revenue streams while building relationships with younger customers, who might become valuable long-term patrons. The artistic patronage and cultural sponsorship activities that evening operations facilitated reflected the important role that establishments like Marguerite's played in medieval cultural development and the sophisticated understanding of marketing and public relations that successful operators possessed. Sponsoring musicians, artists, writers, or performers can enhance the establishment's reputation, attract wealthy patrons, and contribute to community cultural development in ways that generated positive publicity and regulatory goodwill. Meanwhile, artistic activities could provide unique entertainment options that differentiated the establishment from competitors while creating opportunities for cultural innovation and creative collaboration that enhance the overall customer experience. The diplomatic and political networking that occurred during evening hours was sophisticated enough to influence local and regional political developments through the relationships and information exchanges that took place in these neutral social environments. Medieval politics were intensely personal and often conducted through informal channels, making establishments like Marguerite's important venues for political relationship building and strategic planning. Representatives of different political factions could meet without the protocol complications that formal political settings required, while the relaxed social atmosphere facilitated the kind of personal relationship building that was essential for medieval political success. Still, political activities also created risks as well as opportunities, requiring careful balance between serving customer interests and avoiding entanglement in political conflicts that could threaten business survival. When the church bells rang the late evening hours and most of medieval Europe settled into sleep, Marguerite's establishment entered its most profitable and socially complex phase. If you thought medieval society was all early bedtimes and moral restraint, the late-night operations of establishments like hers would completely shatter those assumptions. This was when the real medieval Europe emerged, sophisticated, hedonistic, and surprisingly modern in its pursuit of pleasure and social connection. Let's be honest about what happened after 10 p.m. in medieval cities. The social masks came off completely. The guildmaster who spent his days enforcing workplace morality became a generous patron sharing ribald jokes with apprentices. The stern church official revealed a knowledge of secular music that would scandalize his daytime colleagues. The wealthy merchant's wife, supposedly confined to domestic duties, might appear disguised for adventures her husband never suspected. Meanwhile, visiting nobles mixed freely with wealthy commoners in ways that daylight social protocols would never permit. The customer dynamics during late-night hours were endlessly fascinating. Regular patrons had established relationships with specific staff members and expected personalized service that went far beyond simple transactions. These weren't just business relationships. They were complex emotional and social connections that provided medieval people with intimacy and understanding often missing from their official lives. To be fair, medieval marriage was primarily an economic and social arrangement, leaving many people seeking emotional fulfillment through relationships that modern society would consider inappropriate but medieval culture tacitly accepted. Managing multiple simultaneous activities during late-night operations required skills that would impress modern event coordinators. The main hall might host a drinking competition between rival guild members, while musicians provided entertainment and serving staff managed increasingly complex orders. Private chambers accommodated intimate encounters, sensitive business discussions, and the kind of personal counseling that helped customers navigate the social and emotional challenges of medieval life. Meanwhile, semi-private areas served groups celebrating successful ventures or conducting the informal negotiations that couldn't happen during daylight hours. The entertainment during late night hours pushed boundaries in ways that reveal surprising aspects of medieval culture. Musicians performed songs that were explicitly sexual, politically subversive, or socially satirical, content that would be dangerous or inappropriate during daytime hours. Storytellers shared tales that ranged from classical literature to contemporary gossip, often blending fact and fiction in ways that provided both entertainment and social commentary. And yet, the most sophisticated entertainment was often the conversation itself. Wit, intelligence, and verbal skills were highly valued in medieval society. making clever discourse as prized as any formal performance. But here's where late night operations reveal the true complexity of medieval social structures, the temporary suspension of normal hierarchies. A successful brothel owner like Marguerite wielded significant social influence during these hours, mediating disputes between customers of different social classes, facilitating business relationships that crossed traditional boundaries, and providing neutral territory where political enemies could coexist peacefully. Sound familiar? It's like modern diplomatic receptions, except with more alcohol and fewer formal protocols. The pricing structures for late-night services were remarkably sophisticated, involving everything from hourly rates and package deals to credit arrangements and barter transactions. Wealthy customers might pay premium prices for exclusive access or personalized services, while regular patrons received loyalty discounts that encouraged repeat business. Meanwhile, group rates accommodated celebration parties, business entertainment, and the kind of social gatherings that generated both immediate revenue and long-term customer relationships. Of course, managing these complex pricing structures required constant attention to fairness, profitability, and competitive positioning. Staff management during late-night hours required understanding individual capabilities, customer preferences, and the social dynamics that determine successful matches between service providers and clients. Some staff members excelled at entertaining wealthy patrons who expected sophisticated conversation and refined behavior, while others specialized in managing working-class customers who wanted straightforward service and unpretentious companionship. Meanwhile, security staff had to balance crowd control with customer service, maintaining order without destroying the relaxed atmosphere that customers valued. The information networks that operated during late-night hours were extraordinary. Alcohol-loosened tongues revealed business secrets, political developments, family scandals, and personal information that had significant value in medieval society's rumor-driven communication system. Marguerite and her staff collected this intelligence while maintaining the discretion that kept customers comfortable sharing sensitive information. Still, they also strategically shared information in ways that facilitated business deals, prevented conflicts, and maintained their establishment's reputation as a valuable social resource. Let's talk about the security challenges that late-night operations presented. Medieval cities were dangerous after dark, and establishments like Marguerite's attracted both legitimate customers and various criminal elements looking for opportunities. Intoxicated customers might start fights over business disputes, romantic rivalries, or simple misunderstandings that could escalate quickly in a society where most men carried weapons. Meanwhile, external threats included thieves targeting wealthy patrons, rival business owners attempting sabotage, and moral authorities conducting surprise raids designed to catch establishments violating regulations. The competitive landscape during late-night hours was particularly intense because this was when the most profitable customers made their spending decisions. Rival establishments used everything from entertainment quality and service levels to pricing strategies and staff poaching to attract customers. Marguerite had to maintain competitive advantages while building customer loyalty that could withstand aggressive recruitment attempts. And yet, she also had to collaborate with competitors when mutual interests were at stake, such as coordinating responses to regulatory changes or sharing information about criminal threats. Quality control during late-night operations was both crucial and challenging. Food safety became more important as the evening progressed and customers consumed increasing amounts of alcohol that could mask spoilage or contamination. Beverage quality required constant monitoring because watered wine or weak ale could destroy customer relationships and generate complaints to authorities. Meanwhile, Staff behavior had to maintain professional standards even as customers became more demanding and social situations grew more complex. The financial management during late-night hours was particularly demanding because this was when the most money changed hands and the most complex transactions occurred. Credit arrangements, group payments, and barter deals all required careful tracking to prevent disputes or losses. Meanwhile, cash security became increasingly important as receipts accumulated and the risks of theft or robbery increased. Medieval banking was limited, making secure storage and careful record-keeping essential for business survival. Customer relationship management during late-night operations required balancing individual attention with group dynamics, personal preferences with business objectives, and immediate satisfaction with long-term loyalty building. Regular customers expected recognition and personalized service that acknowledged their importance to the business, while new visitors needed welcoming treatment that encouraged repeat visits. Meanwhile, mixed groups required careful management to ensure that different social levels and personal relationships didn't create conflicts that could disrupt the entire establishment's atmosphere. The social dynamics during late-night hours revealed aspects of medieval culture that daylight activities concealed. Class boundaries became more fluid, gender roles were more flexible, and social behaviors were more relaxed than official medieval culture acknowledged. These establishments provided outlets for human needs and desires that medieval society's formal structures couldn't accommodate, making them essential social institutions, despite their official moral questionability. The alternative economy activities that flourished during late-night hours represented some of the most innovative and historically significant aspects of medieval brothel operations, creating parallel economic systems that supplemented and sometimes circumvented official commercial and financial institutions. Marguerite's establishment might serve as a center for alternative currency systems, barter networks, and informal banking arrangements that provided financial services unavailable through official channels. These alternative economic activities were particularly important for customers who couldn't access formal financial institutions due to religious restrictions, political problems, or social constraints that limited their participation in official commercial systems. The scientific and intellectual exchange that occurred during late-night hours reflected the limited availability of formal educational institutions and the networking opportunities that brought together educated individuals from different backgrounds and disciplines. Medieval scholars, physicians, natural philosophers, and educated merchants might use establishments like Marguerite's as informal academic centers where they could share knowledge, debate ideas, and collaborate on intellectual projects that were difficult to pursue in more formal settings. These intellectual activities contributed to medieval scientific and philosophical development, while creating unique value propositions that attracted educated customers and differentiated sophisticated establishments from their less intellectually oriented competitors. The technological espionage and industrial intelligence activities that some late-night operations facilitated reflected the competitive dynamics of medieval commerce and the valuable technical knowledge that successful businesses needed to maintain their market positions. Craft secrets, manufacturing techniques, and business innovations were closely guarded by guilds and individual operators, making industrial intelligence gathering both valuable and dangerous. Marguerite's establishment might serve as a neutral venue where technical knowledge could be shared, traded, or stolen through the social interactions and business relationships that developed during late-night activities. Of course, facilitating industrial espionage also created legal and ethical risks that required careful management to avoid conflicts with guild authorities or business partners who might discover information theft, the international smuggling, and contraband activities that sometimes occurred during late-night hours. reflected both the profit opportunities available in medieval black markets and the risks associated with operating businesses that existed in legal gray areas. While Marguerite would have been careful to avoid activities that could trigger serious legal prosecution, the establishment might facilitate the discreet movement of goods, information, or people that couldn't be handled through official channels. Medieval trade was heavily regulated and taxed, creating opportunities for profitable but risky activities that required absolute discretion and careful risk management. Still, the potential profits from contraband activities had to be balanced against the catastrophic risks of legal prosecution that could destroy the entire business operation. The psychological experimentation and consciousness exploration that late-night activities sometimes involved reflected both the limited understanding of human psychology in medieval society and the experimental approaches that some individuals used to explore human consciousness and emotional experience. Medieval medicine included various substances and practices that could alter consciousness, and establishments like Marguerite's might provide settings for experimental approaches to psychological exploration that weren't available in more formal contexts. These activities attracted customers seeking unusual experiences while creating unique service offerings that could command premium prices and generate customer loyalty through the provision of services unavailable elsewhere. The revolutionary planning and social change activities that occasionally occurred during late-night hours reflected the political tensions and social pressures that characterized medieval society and the neutral territories that establishments like Marguerite's provided for discussions that would be dangerous in more public settings. While successful operators like Marguerite would avoid obvious involvement in seditious activities, the establishment might serve as a meeting place for individuals planning social, economic, or political changes that challenged existing power structures. Medieval society was constantly evolving, and many changes that seem inevitable in historical perspective were planned and coordinated through informal networks that included establishments operating outside normal social constraints. The hours between midnight and dawn represented the most fascinating and revealing period of medieval brothel operations, when Marguerite's establishment transformed into something that modern society would barely recognize, a complex social institution that served functions far beyond its obvious purpose. If you thought medieval society shut down after sunset, the midnight to dawn operations would completely change your understanding of how medieval people actually lived, worked, and conducted their most important business. Let's be clear about what midnight meant in medieval Europe. This was when the real power brokers emerged. The customers who arrived during these underground hours weren't your typical evening revelers. They were people who couldn't afford to be seen during normal social hours, but whose business and political influence shaped medieval society. That's right. Some of the most important decisions affecting medieval cities were made in establishments like Marguerite's during the hours when official society was supposedly asleep. The clientele during these hours included married nobles conducting affairs that could destabilize political alliances, church officials engaging in behaviors that would destroy their careers, merchants negotiating deals that circumvented guild regulations, and political figures planning strategies that couldn't be discussed in formal settings. To be fair, medieval society's rigid social structures and moral codes created enormous pressure for hypocrisy. People needed outlets for behaviors and relationships that their official positions couldn't accommodate. Managing the midnight to dawn shift required unprecedented discretion and social intelligence. Marguerite had to ensure the political enemies didn't encounter each other, that sensitive business discussions remained confidential, and that the kind of scandals that could destroy careers and family fortunes never became public knowledge. Meanwhile, she had to balance the competing demands of customers who expected exclusive attention with the practical needs of running a business that served multiple clients simultaneously. The physical security during these hours was particularly complex because the stakes were so much higher. A robbery or assault during evening hours might cost money and reputation, but scandals involving midnight customers could trigger political crises, family feuds, or religious persecution that affected entire communities. Sound familiar? It's like modern security for high-profile events, except the threats were more personal and the consequences more severe. But here's where midnight operations reveal the true sophistication of medieval intelligence networks. The information trading that occurred during these hours was phenomenal. Political secrets, military plans, economic intelligence, and personal scandals were shared, traded, and strategically deployed in ways that influenced everything from local business deals to international diplomatic relations. Marguerite wasn't just running a brothel. She was operating a medieval version of a high-security information broker that connected power networks across social and political boundaries. The entertainment during midnight hours was equally sophisticated and subversive. Musicians performed songs that were politically dangerous, socially revolutionary, or religiously heretical, content that could result in imprisonment or execution if performed in public settings. Storytellers shared tales that revealed the true scandals and secret histories of medieval society, providing customers with information that was both entertaining and strategically valuable. Meanwhile, the conversations themselves often involved planning activities that would reshape political and economic relationships throughout the region. Staff selection for midnight operations required extraordinary judgment and reliability. These weren't just service providers. They were confidential assistants who needed to understand complex political relationships, maintain absolute discretion about sensitive information, and provide emotional support for customers dealing with the enormous pressures of medieval power politics. And yet, they also had to be prepared for emergency situations that could arise when powerful people with conflicting interests found themselves in close proximity. The pricing structures for midnight services reflected their unique value and risk levels. Premium rates acknowledged both the specialized discretion required and the potential dangers involved in serving high-profile customers during sensitive hours. Meanwhile, package deals accommodated the complex needs of customers who required multiple services, companionship, information, secure meeting spaces, and sometimes even protection from political or personal enemies. Of course, credit arrangements became more important because midnight customers often couldn't risk carrying large amounts of cash that could be traced to their activities. Let's discuss the regulatory compliance challenges that midnight operations presented. City authorities, church officials, and guild representatives all had different rules about nighttime activities. But enforcing these regulations was complicated by the political influence of midnight customers. Marguerite had to navigate situations where her customers included the same officials who were supposed to regulate her business, creating conflicts of interest that required careful management to avoid legal troubles or political retaliation. The competitive dynamics during midnight hours were particularly intense because the customer base was limited and the profit margins were enormous. Rival establishments used everything from superior security and absolute discretion to political connections and information access to attract high-value customers. Meanwhile, the stakes of losing customers or failing to maintain confidentiality were much higher than during normal business hours, making operational excellence absolutely critical for survival. Quality control during midnight operations extended far beyond normal hospitality standards to include information security, political risk management, and crisis response capabilities. A single security breach, indiscretion, or operational failure could destroy not just the business, but also the lives and careers of customers whose patronage required absolute confidentiality. Still, the rewards for successful midnight operations were substantial enough to justify the extraordinary care and expense required to maintain appropriate standards. The social dynamics during midnight hours revealed the enormous gap between medieval society's official moral codes and the actual behavior of its most powerful members. The same religious officials who preached against sin during daylight hours engaged in behaviors that contradicted their public positions. Political leaders who demanded moral behavior from their subjects lived lives that would scandalize modern politicians. Meanwhile, the wealthy merchants and nobles who funded moral crusades were often the most enthusiastic customers for services that those same crusades condemned. Customer relationship management during midnight hours required understanding not just individual preferences and needs, but also the complex web of political and personal relationships that connected medieval power networks. A single mistake in social protocol could trigger conflicts that affected business operations, political stability, and personal safety. Meanwhile, successful relationship management during these hours could provide access to information, protection, and opportunities that were impossible to obtain through normal business channels. The psychological aspects of midnight operations were equally complex. Many customers were dealing with enormous stress from their public responsibilities, family pressures, and social expectations that medieval society imposed on powerful individuals. Establishments like Marguerite's provided not just physical services but also emotional support, confidential counseling, and social outlets that helped medieval power brokers manage the psychological demands of their positions. The financial implications of midnight operations extended far beyond immediate transaction revenues. The relationships built, information gained, and favors exchanged during these hours often generated business opportunities, political protection, and competitive advantages that were worth far more than direct service payments. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining midnight operations, specialized staff, enhanced security, absolute discretion, were substantial but necessary investments in long-term business survival and growth. The witness protection and identity concealment services that midnight operations sometimes provided reflected the dangerous political and social environment of medieval society and the unique security capabilities that establishments like Marguerite's could offer to customers facing existential threats. Medieval politics were violent and personal, creating situations where individuals needed to disappear, change identities, or hide from enemies who could destroy their lives or end their existence. Successful brothel operators developed networks and capabilities that could provide identity concealment, safe passage, and protective services that weren't available through official channels. These security services commanded premium prices while creating extremely valuable customer loyalty among individuals whose survival depended on discretion and protection. The historical document preservation and archive services that some midnight operations provided reflected both the limited literacy in medieval society and the valuable historical and business documents that needed secure storage and professional management. Important contracts, political correspondence, family records, and business documents required protection from theft, fire, political seizure, and natural deterioration that could destroy evidence of legal rights, business relationships, and historical events. Marguerite's establishment might serve as an informal archive and document security service, providing storage and protection for valuable papers, while creating additional revenue streams and gathering intelligence about important historical and commercial developments. The alchemical and medical experimentation that occasionally occurred during midnight hours reflected the limited scientific knowledge available in medieval society and the experimental approaches that some individuals used to advance understanding of natural phenomena and human health. Medieval medicine was a mixture of practical knowledge, religious belief, and experimental investigation that often required discrete settings for activities that might be considered heretical or dangerous by religious or political authorities. Establishments like Marguerite's could provide laboratory space, experimental subjects, and discrete environments for medical and alchemical research that contributed to medieval scientific development while creating unique service offerings and revenue opportunities. The marriage brokerage and family alliance coordination that midnight operations sometimes facilitated reflected the complex social and economic negotiations that governed medieval family relationships and the neutral territories that establishments like Marguerite's provided for sensitive family and political negotiations. Medieval marriages were primarily economic and political arrangements that required careful negotiation between families, social classes, and political factions with competing interests and complex relationship histories. Successful brothel operators could serve as intermediaries and negotiation facilitators who understood the social dynamics and could help families reach agreements that served their mutual interests while avoiding conflicts that could escalate into violent feuds. The religious and spiritual counseling that some midnight operations provided reflected both the complex relationship between medieval Christianity and establishments like Marguerite's, and the spiritual needs of individuals who couldn't access official religious services due to social, political, or personal circumstances. While officially condemned by religious authorities, these establishments sometimes provided spiritual guidance, confession services, and religious counseling for customers who needed spiritual support but couldn't risk exposure through official church channels. These religious services required extremely discreet management and qualified staff members who could provide legitimate spiritual guidance while avoiding conflicts with official religious authorities. The assassination, planning, and political violence coordination that occasionally occurred during midnight hours represented the darkest and most dangerous aspects of medieval political life and the extreme risks that establishments like Marguerite's faced when serving customers involved in violent political conflicts. Medieval politics often included assassination, political murder, and organized violence as legitimate tools for achieving political objectives, creating demand for neutral meeting places where such activities could be planned and coordinated. While successful operators like Marguerite would avoid obvious involvement in violent activities, the establishment might serve as a meeting place for individuals, planning political violence that could reshape local or regional power structures. Through the elimination of political enemies, understanding the weekly rhythms of medieval brothel operations reveals how deeply these establishments were integrated into the broader economic and social patterns that governed medieval life. Marguerite didn't just manage daily operations. She had to navigate weekly cycles that were as predictable as they were complex, involving everything from religious observances and market days to guild meetings and seasonal celebrations that dramatically affected customer demographics and business volume. Let's be honest about medieval weekly patterns. They were nothing like our modern Monday through Friday work schedules. Medieval time was organized around religious calendars, agricultural cycles, and market patterns that created weekly rhythms completely different from contemporary business cycles. If you thought modern businesses had to deal with seasonal variations, medieval operations faced weekly fluctuations that could swing from feast to famine, based on factors ranging from church holidays to weather patterns. Market days were absolutely crucial to brothel operations because they brought influxes of travelers, merchants, and customers with ready cash to spend on entertainment and services. These weren't just busy days, they were make-or-break opportunities that could determine whether an establishment remained profitable through slower periods. To be fair, medieval market days were major social and economic events that drew people from surrounding regions, creating temporary population booms that smart business owners planned for months in advance. the preparation for market days began. Early in the week with inventory planning, staff scheduling, and relationship management designed to maximize opportunities when potential customers flooded into town. Marguerite had to coordinate with suppliers to ensure adequate food and beverage stocks, arrange for additional security to handle larger crowds, and negotiate with staff for extended hours and increased responsibilities. Meanwhile, she also had to prepare for the increased competition as rival establishments implemented their own strategies for capturing market day business. But here's where weekly planning gets really complex. The religious calendar. Medieval Christianity dominated weekly schedules through feast days, fast days, holy days, and religious observances that could either boost or destroy business depending on their nature and local enforcement. Some religious holidays brought celebration and increased customer activity, while others imposed more restrictions that could shut down operations entirely. Sound familiar? It's like modern businesses dealing with holiday shopping seasons, except the religious authorities had legal power to enforce their preferences. The relationship between brothel operations and guild activities created another layer of weekly complexity. Guild meetings, craft demonstrations, apprenticeship ceremonies, and trade negotiations all affected customer availability and spending patterns. Successful brothel owners like Marguerite maintained detailed knowledge of guild schedules and developed relationships with guild leaders that could provide advance warning about events that might affect business operations. Of course, they also had to navigate the complex politics between different guilds whose members might have conflicting business interests or personal rivalries. Seasonal patterns within weekly cycles added yet another dimension to operational planning. Spring weeks brought different customer demographics than winter weeks, while summer market days attracted different travelers than autumn commercial gatherings. Agricultural cycles affected rural customers' cash flow and availability, while trade season variations influenced merchant behavior and spending patterns. Meanwhile, weather patterns could dramatically affect travel and commerce, making flexible planning essential for business survival. Let's talk about the competitive dynamics that played out over weekly cycles. Rival establishments often targeted specific days or customer segments, creating weekly patterns of competition that required strategic responses. Some operators focused on capturing market day business through aggressive pricing and premium services, while others specialized in serving regular customers during slower periods when personalized attention and relationship building were more important than volume operations. Staff management over weekly cycles required understanding individual capabilities, preferences, and availability, while balancing customer service needs with employee satisfaction and retention. Medieval employment relationships were intensely personal, and successful business owners understood that maintaining staff loyalty required accommodating individual circumstances and preferences whenever possible. Still, they also had to ensure adequate coverage during peak periods and maintain service quality during slower times when reduced staffing might tempt corners cutting that could damage long-term customer relationships. The financial management over weekly cycles was particularly challenging because income and expenses fluctuated dramatically based on religious calendars, market schedules, and seasonal patterns. Marguerite had to maintain cash flow during slow periods while accumulating resources for the inventory purchases, staff payments, and operational expansions that peak periods required. Medieval banking was limited, making personal financial management and business cash flow planning essential skills for long-term survival. Customer relationship management over weekly cycles required balancing the needs of regular patrons who expected consistent service with the opportunities presented by periodic visitors who might become valuable long-term customers. Regular customers provided stable revenue and predictable demand, while market day visitors offered chances for significant short-term profits and potential relationship building. Meanwhile, the social dynamics between regular and visiting customers required careful management to prevent conflicts that could damage business atmosphere and customer satisfaction. The information networks that operated over weekly cycles were crucial for business planning and competitive advantage. Market day brought news from other regions. Guild meetings revealed changes in local regulations or business conditions. And religious gatherings provided intelligence about moral campaigns or political developments that could affect brothel operations. Successful operators like Marguerite collected, processed, and strategically used this information to anticipate opportunities and avoid problems that less well-informed competitors might miss. Quality control over weekly cycles required, maintaining consistent standards despite dramatic variations in customer volume, staff workload, and operational complexity. Peak periods tested every aspect of the operation: food quality, service levels, security effectiveness, and facility maintenance, while slower periods offered opportunities for improvements and preparations that could enhance performance during subsequent busy times. Meanwhile, the reputation effects of quality problems were magnified during market days when larger audiences could spread negative word of mouth more widely. The regulatory compliance over weekly cycles was complicated by the interaction between religious, civil, and guild authorities who might have different enforcement priorities and inspection schedules. Church officials might increase scrutiny during religious seasons, while city authorities could step up enforcement during market days when increased activity attracted more attention. Meanwhile, guild regulations might be more strictly enforced during periods when competitive pressures were highest and complaints from rival businesses were most likely. Strategic planning over weekly cycles required understanding how short-term patterns connected to longer-term business objectives and market conditions. Successful market day operations could provide resources for facility improvements, staff expansion, or competitive initiatives that enhanced long-term market position. Meanwhile, effective relationship building during slower periods could generate customer loyalty and business intelligence that provided advantages during subsequent competitive challenges. The social impact of weekly rhythms extended beyond immediate business operations to influence broader community relationships and economic development. Successful brothel operations contributed to local economic activity, supported employment, and provided services that facilitated commerce and social interaction throughout the community. And yet, they also had to manage the social tensions and moral conflicts that their existence created within medieval society's complex value systems. As weekly patterns repeated and evolved over monthly and seasonal cycles, Marguerite's understanding of these rhythms became increasingly sophisticated and valuable. The ability to predict, plan for, and capitalize on weekly variations in customer demand, competitive intensity, and operational requirements was what separated successful long-term operators from businesses that failed to adapt to the complex temporal patterns that govern medieval economic and social life. Managing a medieval brothel meant preparing for crises that would make modern business disaster planning seem quaint by comparison. Marguerite didn't just worry about customer complaints or supply chain disruptions. She had to prepare for everything from plague outbreaks and religious persecutions to political upheavals and military conflicts that could destroy her business overnight. If you thought modern crisis management was challenging, medieval business owners faced existential threats that could emerge without warning and require immediate life or death responses. Let's be clear about the scope of medieval crises. They weren't just business challenges. They were survival situations. A moral crusade led by zealous church officials could result in imprisonment, property confiscation, and public execution. Political conflicts could transform valued customers into dangerous enemies who might use their knowledge of the establishment to settle scores. Plague outbreaks could kill staff and customers while destroying the social networks that sustain business operations. Meanwhile, military conflicts could bring occupying armies with completely different legal systems and social expectations. Religious crises were particularly dangerous because they combined moral authority with legal power and popular sentiment. A new bishop, a visiting religious reformer, or a local moral panic could transform decades of careful relationship building into deadly liabilities overnight. To be fair, medieval Christianity was experiencing constant internal conflicts over doctrine, practice, and social issues, making religious attitudes toward establishments like Marguerite's unpredictable and potentially explosive. Sound familiar? It's like modern businesses dealing with social media outrage campaigns, except the consequences included physical violence and legal persecution. Political crises required equally sophisticated responses because medieval politics were intensely personal and could change rapidly based on marriages, deaths, wars, or shifting alliances that had nothing to do with local business operations. A customer who provided protection and support could become a dangerous enemy if political winds shifted, while rival business owners might gain political influence that they could use to destroy competitors. Meanwhile, changes in royal policies, city leadership, or guild power structures could invalidate existing business arrangements and require complete operational overhauls. But here's where medieval crisis management gets really complex. The interconnected nature of medieval social networks meant that crises rarely remained isolated. A conflict with church authorities could trigger investigations by city officials, while political problems could encourage business rivals to escalate competitive conflicts into legal challenges. Economic disruptions affected customer spending power, while social upheavals could transform loyal employees into security threats. Successful crisis management required understanding these interconnections and preparing for cascade effects that could amplify initial problems into existential challenges. Economic crises presented their own unique challenges because medieval economies were much more volatile and less diversified than modern systems. Crop failures could eliminate rural customer spending power. Trade disruptions could affect merchant clientele, and currency devaluations could destroy carefully accumulated savings. Meanwhile, guild conflicts could disrupt supply chains, while political instability could make business investments and expansion plans impossible to sustain. And yet, economic crises also created opportunities for businesses that could adapt quickly and serve changing customer needs. Health crises were particularly terrifying because medieval medicine was limited and disease outbreaks could devastate both staff and customer populations. Plague outbreaks didn't just reduce business volume. They could kill the key staff members, regular customers, and business relationships that took years to develop. Meanwhile, the social disruption caused by health crises could transform community attitudes toward establishments that were associated with moral corruption and divine punishment. Still, successful operators understood that health crises also created demand for comfort, companionship, and social connection that their establishments could provide. The early warning systems that successful operators like Marguerite developed were sophisticated information networks that provided advance notice of potential crises. These networks included suppliers who reported on economic conditions, customers who shared political intelligence, staff members who monitored community sentiment, and competitors who sometimes provided mutual support when faced with common threats. Of course, maintaining these networks required ongoing investment in relationships, information sharing, and mutual assistance that went far beyond normal business operations. Crisis response planning involved developing multiple contingency strategies for different types of threats while maintaining the flexibility to adapt when actual crises didn't match predicted scenarios. Marguerite had the plan for everything from temporary closure and staff evacuation to complete relocation and business model transformation. Meanwhile, she had to maintain emergency resources, cash reserves, alternative supply sources, escape routes, and safe houses that could be activated quickly when crises emerged. The costs of this preparation were substantial, but the survival rates of unprepared businesses were virtually zero. Let's discuss the communication strategies that effective crisis management required. During crises, normal information channels often became unreliable or dangerous, making alternative communication methods essential for coordinating responses and maintaining relationships. Successful operators developed networks of trusted messengers, coded communication systems, and secure meeting locations that could function even when normal social and business relationships were disrupted. Meanwhile, they had to balance the need for information gathering with the risks of exposure that could make dangerous situations worse. Staff management during crises required understanding individual loyalties, capabilities, and vulnerabilities, while providing leadership that maintained morale and operational effectiveness despite enormous stress and uncertainty. Medieval employment relationships were personal and often involved emotional bonds that went beyond simple economic arrangements, making staff loyalty both more important and more complex than modern employment relationships. Still, crises also revealed which staff members could be trusted with sensitive information and critical responsibilities during emergency situations. Customer relationship management during crises required delicate balancing between maintaining valuable relationships and avoiding associations that could become dangerous liabilities. Regular customers who had been assets during normal operations might become security threats if their own circumstances changed, while new customers might represent either opportunities or risks that were difficult to evaluate quickly. Meanwhile, the social dynamics that governed customer interactions during normal times could become completely transformed during crisis situations. The financial management during crises involved both protecting existing resources and generating cash flow needed for crisis response activities. Normal revenue streams might disappear overnight, while crisis response costs, bribes, emergency supplies, security measures, relocation expenses could be enormous. Successful operators maintained diverse revenue sources and liquid assets that could be quickly converted to meet emergency needs. And yet, they also had to avoid financial moves that could signal desperation or attract unwanted attention from authorities or competitors. Recovery planning began before crises ended, involving strategies for rebuilding operations, restoring relationships, and adapting to changed circumstances that crises often created. Medieval society was constantly evolving, and crises often accelerated changes that required businesses to develop new approaches, serve different customer segments, or operate under modified legal and social frameworks. Meanwhile, the reputation effects of crisis management, both positive and negative, could influence business prospects for years after actual crises ended. The psychological aspects of crisis management were equally important because medieval crises often involved life or death situations that created enormous stress for business owners, staff, and customers. Successful operators like Marguerite understood that maintaining morale, confidence, and decision-making effectiveness during crises required emotional intelligence and leadership skills that went far beyond normal business management. Still, they also had to prepare for the possibility that some crises might require accepting total losses and starting over in new locations with completely different identities. Learning from crisis experiences was essential for improving future preparedness and response capabilities. Each crisis provided lessons about warning signs, response effectiveness, network reliability, and recovery strategies that could enhance survival chances during subsequent emergencies. Meanwhile, sharing crisis management knowledge with trusted allies and competitors could create mutual support networks that increased everyone's chances of surviving the next inevitable medieval catastrophe. The long-term legacy of medieval brothel operations like Marguerite's extended far beyond their immediate economic functions to influence the development of modern business practices, social institutions, and cultural attitudes in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. If you thought these establishments were simply about providing services, their actual impact on medieval society was so profound and multifaceted that ignoring them means missing crucial elements of how European civilization evolved into its modern form. Let's be honest about the historical significance. Medieval brothels were among Europe's first true service industries, developing business practices that wouldn't be formally recognized by mainstream commerce for centuries. That's right. Concepts like customer relationship management, market segmentation, competitive intelligence, and service quality standardization were being implemented in brothels long before they appeared in other industries. The reason? Economic necessity and social complexity created business environments that required sophisticated management approaches just to survive. The economic impact of establishments like Marguerite's extended throughout medieval urban economies in ways that modern economists are beginning to recognize and quantify. These businesses generated direct employment for hundreds of thousands of people across Europe, created demand for goods and services from countless other industries, and facilitated business relationships that drove commercial development in medieval cities. To be fair, the medieval economy was much more integrated than traditional historical accounts suggest, and brothels played crucial roles in the commercial networks that connected local markets to international trade systems. But here's where the legacy gets really interesting. The financial innovations that brothel operations developed. Medieval establishments like Marguerite's were among the first businesses to implement sophisticated credit systems, insurance arrangements, and banking services that later became standard business practices. They developed techniques for managing cash flow, currency exchange, and international transactions that influenced the development of medieval banking and finance. Meanwhile, their approaches to risk management and business partnerships provided models that other industries eventually adopted and refined. The social impact was equally profound and complicated. Medieval brothels served as social institutions that provided functions that formal medieval society couldn't accommodate. Spaces for cross-class interaction, outlets for individual expression, and sources of emotional support that helped people navigate the psychological challenges of medieval life. Sound familiar? They were essentially early versions of modern social clubs, counseling services, and networking organizations, except they operated in societies that had no other institutions serving these functions. Women's economic opportunities in medieval Europe were severely limited, but brothel operations provided some of the few avenues for female entrepreneurship and financial independence that existed during this period. Successful brothel owners like Marguerite wielded economic power and social influence that were otherwise unavailable to medieval women, while the women working in these establishments often achieved greater economic autonomy than their married counterparts. And yet, this economic empowerment came with social costs and personal risks that highlight the complex trade-offs that medieval society imposed on women seeking independence. The information networks that developed around medieval brothel operations influenced political and economic development throughout Europe in ways that historians are still discovering. These establishments served as communication hubs that connected local communities to broader European networks of trade, politics, and cultural exchange. Intelligence gathered and processed through brothel networks influenced everything from local business decisions to international diplomatic strategies. Meanwhile, the social connections facilitated through these establishments helped create the relationship networks that drove medieval economic and political development. Let's discuss the legal and regulatory innovations that brothel operations prompted. Medieval cities developed some of Europe's first comprehensive business regulations specifically to manage brothel operations, creating legal frameworks that established precedents for regulating other service industries. These regulations addressed everything from pricing standards and quality control to worker protection and customer rights, legal concepts that were revolutionary for their time and influential for subsequent legal development. Of course, the enforcement of these regulations also required developing new approaches to municipal administration and law enforcement that influenced broader governmental evolution. The architectural and urban planning impact of medieval brothel districts was significant because these establishments influenced the development of medieval city layouts, building designs, and neighborhood organization. Brothel districts often became centers of commercial activity that attracted other businesses, drove real estate development, and influenced transportation patterns within medieval cities. Meanwhile, the security and privacy requirements of brothel operations led to architectural innovations that influenced broader building practices and urban design principles. Cultural influence extended beyond immediate economic and social impacts to affect literature, art, music, and intellectual development throughout medieval Europe. The entertainment provided in establishments like Marguerite's influenced the development of popular culture, while the social interactions facilitated by these establishments contributed to the exchange of ideas that drove intellectual and artistic innovation. Still, the cultural legacy is complicated because social attitudes toward these establishments were ambivalent and often hypocritical, creating tensions that influenced European cultural development in complex ways. The religious impact was equally complex and historically significant. Medieval church attitudes toward prostitution evolved partly in response to the practical reality of establishments like Marguerite's, leading to theological and legal developments that influenced broader Christian doctrine and practice. The ongoing negotiations between religious authorities and brothel operators contributed to the development of medieval canon law, while the moral debates surrounding these establishments influenced philosophical and theological thinking about human nature, social organization, and spiritual salvation. International connections developed through medieval brothel networks contributed to European economic and cultural integration in ways that traditional historical accounts often overlook. Traveling customers, international staff, and cross-border business relationships created communication channels that facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and innovations across political boundaries. Meanwhile, the standardization of services and practices across different regions contributed to the development of common European cultural and commercial standards. The technological innovations that brothel operations encouraged included everything from improved sanitation and health practices to advances in security systems and communication methods. The practical challenges of managing these complex businesses drove innovations in accounting, inventory management, and personnel administration that influenced broader business practice development. And yet, many of these innovations remained associated with morally questionable activities, slowing their adoption by more respectable industries. Modern business practices owe more to medieval brothel operations than most entrepreneurs realize. Customer service standards, quality control systems, competitive analysis, and relationship management techniques that are considered fundamental to modern business were pioneered by establishments like Marguerite's centuries before they became standard practice. Meanwhile, approaches to managing complex social dynamics handling crisis situations, and building sustainable business relationships. Developed in medieval brothels, provided models that remain relevant for contemporary service industries. The research challenges involved in studying medieval brothel operations highlight broader problems with understanding women's economic roles, unofficial social institutions, and the informal networks that actually governed medieval life. Traditional historical sources often ignored or misrepresented these establishments, making their actual social and economic importance difficult to assess. Still, recent scholarship using alternative sources and analytical approaches is revealing the extent to which these institutions influenced medieval society and contributed to European historical development. As we conclude our exploration of Marguerite's world, it's clear that medieval brothel operations were far more complex, influential, and historically significant than traditional accounts suggest. These establishments served multiple social and economic functions that helped shape European civilization in ways that continue to influence modern society. Understanding their legacy provides insights not just into medieval history, but into the ongoing relationships between economics, society, and human nature that continue to shape contemporary business and social development. Let's be honest about the financial reality of running a medieval brothel. These weren't just businesses. They were some of the most sophisticated economic enterprises in medieval Europe, generating wealth and wielding financial influence that would make modern corporations envious. If you thought medieval economics was simple bartering and basic commerce, the financial operations of establishments like Marguerite's would completely revolutionize your understanding of medieval capitalism and economic innovation. The revenue streams that successful brothel operations generated were remarkably diverse and sophisticated, extending far beyond the obvious services to include everything from real estate investments and commodity trading to banking services and international finance. That's right. Medieval brothel owners were often among the wealthiest individuals in their communities, accumulating fortunes through business, diversification, and financial innovation that wouldn't be formally recognized by mainstream economics. For centuries, Marguerite's establishment might generate income from hospitality services, entertainment provision, banking and lending, real estate rental, commodity storage, information brokerage, and diplomatic facilitation, a business model that modern economists would recognize as highly advanced portfolio diversification. To be fair, the profit margins on medieval vice were extraordinary because demand was consistent, competition was limited by regulatory barriers, and customers were often willing to pay premium prices for quality services and absolute discretion. Meanwhile, the recurring revenue model that successful establishments developed through regular customer relationships provided financial stability that most medieval businesses couldn't achieve. Sound familiar? It's essentially the same subscription economy model that modern businesses strive to create. Except medieval brothel operators were implementing these approaches centuries before they became standard business practice. But here's where the economics get really fascinating: the capital accumulation and investment strategies that successful operators employed. Medieval society offered limited investment opportunities, but brothel owners had access to information, relationships, and capital that enabled sophisticated investment activities. Marguerite might invest in real estate development, commodity trading, manufacturing enterprises, or international trade ventures that leveraged her business relationships and market intelligence to generate returns that exceeded those available through normal commercial activities. These investment strategies required financial sophistication and risk management, capabilities that rivaled those of medieval Europe's most successful merchants and bankers. The currency, exchange, and international finance activities that many establishments provided were crucial services in medieval Europe's complex monetary system, where multiple currencies, varying exchange rates, and limited banking infrastructure created opportunities for profitable financial services. Successful brothel operators often functioned as informal banks, providing currency exchange, international money transfers, and credit services that weren't available through official financial institutions. These financial services generated substantial revenue while creating customer loyalty and providing access to commercial intelligence that enhanced other business activities. Let's talk about the tax, optimization, and regulatory arbitrage strategies that sophisticated operators like Marguerite employed to maximize profitability while managing the complex regulatory environment that governed their operations. Medieval taxation was often arbitrary and inconsistent, creating opportunities for businesses that understood regulatory complexities to minimize tax burdens through strategic business structure and relationship management. Meanwhile, the regulatory gray areas that brothel operations occupied provided opportunities for business activities that were technically legal but officially discouraged, creating competitive advantages for operators who could navigate these complexities successfully. The employment and labor economics of medieval brothel operations were equally sophisticated, involving complex compensation structures, performance incentives, and benefit programs that attracted and retained talented staff in competitive labor markets. Successful operators understood that staff quality directly affected customer satisfaction and business profitability, leading to compensation and benefit programs that often exceeded those available through other medieval employment opportunities. These employment practices included everything from performance bonuses and profit sharing to housing provision and retirement planning that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human resource management and labor economics. The supply chain financing and trade credit systems that many establishments provided reflected their important role in medieval commercial networks and the financial services that businesses needed to manage complex supply chains and inventory requirements. Marguerite's establishment might provide trade financing, inventory loans, and supply chain credit that enabled other businesses to expand operations and improve cash flow management. These financial services generated additional revenue while strengthening business relationships and providing access to commercial intelligence that enhanced competitive positioning. The risk management and insurance services that some operators provided were revolutionary innovations that addressed fundamental business challenges in societies where formal insurance systems didn't exist. Medieval businesses faced constant risks from theft, fire, political upheaval, and economic disruption that could destroy years of accumulated wealth overnight. Successful brothel operators developed informal insurance systems and risk-sharing arrangements that provided financial protection for customers and business partners while generating additional revenue through premium collection and risk assessment services. The wealth accumulation and intergenerational wealth transfer strategies that successful operators employed were sophisticated approaches to building and preserving family fortunes in societies where economic security was constantly threatened by political, social, and economic upheavals. These wealth management strategies included diversified investment portfolios, international asset distribution, and complex legal arrangements that protected accumulated wealth from taxation, confiscation, and political persecution while ensuring successful wealth transfer to subsequent generations. Of course, the economic influence that successful brothel operators wielded extended far beyond their individual business operations to affect broader community economic development and political relationships. Wealthy operators like Marguerite could influence municipal policies, support community development projects, and affect local economic conditions through their business activities and political relationships. This economic influence made them important community stakeholders whose interests had to be considered in local political and economic decision-making. creating feedback loops that enhance their business prospects while contributing to community. Economic development taught the customer service standards that medieval brothel operations maintained would impress modern hospitality professionals with their sophistication, attention to detail, and deep understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. If you thought customer service was a modern business innovation, the service protocols that establishments like Marguerite's developed were centuries ahead of their time, creating customer experiences that built loyalty, generated premium pricing, and established competitive advantages that sustained business success through changing market conditions. Let's be clear about the customer service challenge that medieval operators faced. They had to satisfy customers from every social class, political faction, and cultural background, while maintaining the complex social protocols that medieval society demanded. That's right. A single establishment might serve peasant apprentices, wealthy merchants, minor nobility, and church officials all in the same evening, requiring service approaches that could seamlessly adjust to different social expectations, cultural norms, and individual preferences without creating conflicts or social embarrassment for any customer group. The personalization strategies that successful operators like Marguerite employed were remarkably sophisticated, involving detailed customer intelligence systems that tracked individual preferences, social relationships, and business interests in ways that enabled highly customized service delivery. Medieval customer service was intensely personal because social relationships were crucial for business and political success, making personalized attention essential for customer satisfaction and loyalty. Meanwhile, the information gathering and relationship management required for effective personalization provided competitive advantages through enhanced customer understanding and improved service delivery. To be fair, medieval customer service required psychological insight and emotional intelligence that would challenge modern service professionals. Customers often sought not just entertainment and companionship, but emotional support, social validation, and psychological relief from the stresses and pressures of medieval life. Successful service providers had to understand complex emotional needs while maintaining professional boundaries and managing the delicate social dynamics that could make or break customer relationships. Sound familiar? It's essentially the same emotional labor and psychological sophistication that modern luxury service industries strive to provide. Except medieval operators were developing these capabilities without formal training or professional development resources. But here's where medieval customer service gets really interesting. The conflict resolution and diplomatic skills that service staff required to manage the complex social and political relationships that brought diverse customer groups together in single establishments. Medieval society was filled with personal rivalries, business conflicts, and political disputes that could explode into violence if not carefully managed. Service staff had to recognize potential conflicts, mediate disputes, and maintain peaceful coexistence between customers who might be enemies in other social contexts. These diplomatic skills required understanding complex social relationships and political dynamics, while maintaining neutrality and professional discretion that protected both customers and business operations. The festival and celebration coordination that occurred around weekly and seasonal cycles created some of the most profitable and socially significant activities that establishments like Marguerite's provided for their communities. Medieval society was organized around religious and seasonal celebrations that required extensive planning, coordination, and specialized services that regular businesses couldn't provide due to moral and social constraints. Marguerite's establishment might serve as an unofficial event planning center for celebrations that required discreet coordination, specialized entertainment, and flexible social arrangements that accommodated complex guest lists and political sensitivities. These festival services generated substantial revenue, while building community relationships and demonstrating the establishment's value to local social and economic networks. The pilgrimage and religious travel support services that weekly operations provided reflected the importance of religious travel in medieval society and the specialized hospitality needs of religious travelers required accommodation and services that regular inns couldn't provide due to social and moral constraints. Medieval pilgrimage was a major economic activity that brought travelers from across Europe to religious sites, creating opportunities for specialized hospitality services that could serve pilgrims' needs while maintaining the discreet social arrangements that religious travel sometimes required. Marguerite's establishment might provide accommodation, entertainment, and social services for religious travelers while carefully managing the complex relationship between religious observance and the establishment's primary business activities. The harvest and agricultural cycle coordination that weekly operations required reflected the deep connection between medieval urban businesses and rural agricultural production that provided the foundation for all medieval economic activity. Seasonal agricultural cycles affected everything from food supply and pricing to customer demographics and spending patterns, requiring sophisticated planning and relationship management that connected urban businesses to rural agricultural communities. Marguerite had to coordinate with rural suppliers, plan for seasonal variations in product availability, and manage relationships with agricultural customers, whose spending patterns were closely tied to harvest cycles and agricultural market conditions. The military and warfare support services that some weekly operations provided during periods of conflict reflected the constant military activity that characterized medieval society and the specialized services that military personnel required during periods of active conflict or military preparation. Medieval warfare was a regular feature of political life that created demand for specialized hospitality, intelligence, and support services that could serve military personnel, while maintaining the discreet arrangements that military operations often required. Marguerite's establishment might provide accommodation and services for military personnel while carefully managing the complex political and security implications of serving customers involved in military conflicts. The diplomatic and international relations support that weekly operations sometimes provided reflected the important role that establishments like Marguerite's played in medieval international relations and the specialized services that diplomatic personnel required for conducting official and unofficial international business. Medieval diplomacy was often conducted through informal channels that supplemented official governmental negotiations, creating demand for neutral meeting places and specialized services that could facilitate international relationship building and negotiation. These diplomatic services required sophisticated understanding of international politics and protocol, while providing opportunities for intelligence gathering and relationship building that could benefit the establishment's broader business operations. The technological and innovation diffusion activities that occurred through weekly operations reflected the important role that establishments like Marguerite's played in spreading new technologies, business practices, and innovations across medieval European commercial networks. The diverse customer base and extensive networking opportunities available through these establishments made them important centers for technology transfer and innovation diffusion that contributed to medieval economic development.